Tokyo, 1948. Inside Teikoku Bank, 16 people stood moments away from their deaths. Within minutes, the quiet hum of routine would be replaced by bodies collapsing to the floor, poisoned by a stranger who vanished without a trace. This was not just a crime. It was a performance executed with precision and authority. And the question that has haunted Japan for decades remains the same. Who was he? Part 1. The Massacre. Tokyo, the 26th of January, 1948. The branch of Teikoku Bank in Toshima stood quiet under a curtain of freezing wind. Behind its locked doors, 16 people remained inside, finishing their work. Within minutes, that silence would turn into one of the most haunting crime scenes in Japanese history. When the first police officers arrived, they were met with a scene that would stay with them for decades. Bodies lay scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, and a trail of spilled cups glistening under the pale light. The air carried a sharp chemical odor, almost metallic, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Among the victims, some still clung to faint signs of life, their hands trembling as if reaching for help that would never come. Detectives quickly realized this was no ordinary robbery. There were no shattered locks or signs of forced entry. The cash drawers were partially emptied, but other valuables remained untouched. It looked less like an act of desperation and more like the precision of a calculated execution. Witnesses outside spoke of a man who had entered shortly before the tragedy unfolded. He was described as calm, polite, and convincingly authoritative. He wore a dark coat, a white armband stamped with the emblem of the Tokyo Public Health Department, and carried a small case. He had introduced himself as a doctor sent under orders of the US CART, occupation forces to prevent an outbreak of dysentery. Within that deception lay the seed of catastrophe. Forensic specialists later confirmed that cyanide had been used, but the method was unlike anything they had seen before. The poison was administered in 2 separate doses, disguised as preventive medicine. The victims believed they were being protected. Instead, they swallowed death 1 sip at a time. To the investigators, one question overshadowed every other clue. Who could walk into a bank in broad daylight, convince 16 people to drink a fatal concoction, and disappear without a trace? This was not merely the work of a killer. It was the signature of someone who understood psychology, authority, and fear with surgical precision. And as the evidence began to surface, the mystery only deepened, drawing the police into a hunt for a phantom who seemed to be 1 step ahead from the very beginning. Because in the coming days, they would find the first piece of evidence, and it would lead them to a man no one expected. Part 2, the investigation. The investigation began before dawn, as detectives from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police combed through every corner of the Teikoku Bank branch. What they found raised more questions than answers. The crime scene was strangely immaculate. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no trace of the man who had orchestrated the mass poisoning. The first tangible clue was discovered inside a drawer at the deputy manager's desk, a business card. It bore the seal of the Tokyo Public Health Department and the name Jiro Yamaguchi. To an untrained eye, it seemed legitimate. But forensic analysts quickly noted discrepancies in the typography and ink, details so subtle they would only be noticed by experts. The card was a forgery, one executed with remarkable precision. For investigators, this single piece of evidence suggested something chilling. Whoever had committed the crime was not an amateur. He had the confidence to impersonate an official, the knowledge to create convincing documents, and the ability to manipulate a room full of people into obeying his instructions without resistance. The second breakthrough came from the toxicology report. The victims' stomachs contained a lethal concentration of cyanide. Yet the compound was mixed in an unusual 2-step formula, separated by a non-lethal solution. This method ensured that none of the victims would collapse until every last one of them had ingested the fatal dose. The precision of this approach hinted at a perpetrator with a sophisticated understanding of chemistry, or perhaps even military-grade training in the use of toxins. Survivor testimonies deepened the mystery. The deputy manager, who had spoken the longest with the stranger, described him as polite, well-spoken, and calm. He recalled the man's pale skin, short cropped hair, and 2 faint moles on his left cheek. Another survivor remembered the armband, stark white, with a bold red emblem that looked official enough to silence any doubt. It was a performance so convincing that no one dared question it until it was far too late. These early findings painted a portrait of a perpetrator unlike any the police had ever encountered. He was methodical, composed, and capable of turning fear into a weapon. Yet his identity remained a ghost, hidden in plain sight. As the days passed, detectives would begin to trace his steps through Tokyo's underworld of forged documents and stolen identities. They would uncover patterns linking this tragedy to other smaller incidents, failed attempts that now seemed like rehearsals for the massacre at Teikoku Bank. And those patterns would lead them to a name. It was a name that, at first glance, appeared utterly ordinary. But once it surfaced, it would change the course of the investigation forever. Part 3. The suspect. The trail of forged business cards eventually led investigators to an unexpected figure. His name was Sadamichi Hirasawa. On paper, he seemed far removed from the brutal precision of the Teikoku Bank Massacre. He was not a soldier, nor a chemist, but a painter once celebrated for his mastery of watercolor, now living in quiet obscurity in Tokyo. Detectives studying his background discovered a life marked by sharp contrasts. In his younger years, Hirasawa had enjoyed financial success and social recognition. His paintings were displayed in galleries, and his income far exceeded that of most university graduates. Yet the end of the war had reduced him to near poverty. He was drowning in debt, borrowing from acquaintances to survive. This financial collapse, in the eyes of the police, was a potential motive. But there was another stranger detail. Years earlier, after being bitten by a rabid dog, Hirasawa had undergone emergency treatment. The vaccine left him with severe neurological complications, and doctors diagnosed him with Korsakoff syndrome, a rare condition that damages memory and distorts reality. He was known to forget recent events, misplace conversations, and even fabricate details without realizing it. To the investigators, this peculiar condition was both a puzzle and an opportunity. Could a man suffering from such cognitive impairment really orchestrate a crime of this complexity? Or was his illness precisely what made him the perfect suspect, someone whose confused recollections could be shaped into a confession? Forensic teams examined his home. They uncovered a small quantity of cyanide, the same poison used at the bank. Hirasawa claimed it was for artistic purposes, a pigment once employed in traditional painting. The explanation was plausible, but to the police, it was one more link in a tightening chain. Witnesses were brought in for identification. 3 survivors hesitated, uncertain, but the deputy manager, the one who had spoken with the killer the longest, pointed directly to Hirasawa. His pale complexion, the faint moles on his cheek, and his reserved manner matched what he remembered. That single confirmation gave investigators what they needed. Hirasawa was arrested. During interrogation, his behavior only deepened the mystery. He denied involvement, then admitted guilt, only to retract his confession hours later. Experts observing the case argued that this was the classic pattern of a man battling Korsakoff syndrome, someone who could not separate reality from suggestion. Yet in post-war Japan, such nuance held little weight in a courtroom that still favored swift resolutions over lingering doubt. What began as a search for a phantom was now focused on one fragile, enigmatic man. And as prosecutors prepared their case, the question that haunted the detectives themselves refused to go away. Had they captured a criminal mastermind or merely the most convenient scapegoat in the aftermath of a national tragedy? In the months that followed, the answer would become even more uncertain. Because as the trial approached, another, far darker theory began to emerge, one that reached far beyond Hirasawa, into the shadows of Japan's wartime past. Part 4, The Hidden Hand. As the case against Sadamichi Hirasawa moved forward, a separate thread of the investigation began to emerge, one that led into the shadows of Japan's wartime past. Within the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, a small group of detectives quietly followed an alternative lead, one that pointed away from the frail painter and toward a far more unsettling possibility. The toxicology report had noted that the cyanide compound used in the Teikoku Bank killings was not a common variant. It bore chemical characteristics consistent with substances once developed by Japan's Unit 731, the notorious biological warfare division that had operated in Manchuria during the war. These findings were never released to the public. Instead, they circulated in confidential memos passed quietly between senior officers who debated whether such information should be pursued at all. Further digging uncovered a disturbing pattern. Several men who had served in Unit 731 had quietly returned to civilian life after the war, many of them protected by post-war arrangements between the United States and Japan. Their knowledge of chemical agents was unparalleled, and some of their names appeared faintly but unmistakably in the background of the case. One investigator later recalled in an interview, "It was like touching a live wire. The moment we got close, someone would tell us to stop. The pressure came swiftly. Orders from higher command instructed detectives to suspend inquiries related to former military personnel." The official explanation was that these leads were unsubstantiated and irrelevant to the central case. But inside the department, few believed that. Files were sealed. Witnesses who had once spoken freely began to refuse comment. It was as though an invisible barrier had been erected around that line of inquiry. Meanwhile, the man at the center of this storm, Hirasawa, remained in his cell, his protests of innocence drowned out by the machinery of a prosecution determined to close the case. Yet, among the detectives who had brushed against the classified material, doubt lingered. The precision of the poisoning, the impersonation of a health officer, the calculated timing, it all felt like the work of someone trained for this exact kind of operation, not a sickly painter with a failing memory. Years later, retired officers would admit what they suspected at the time, that the investigation had collided with forces far larger than the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. The involvement of the US occupation authorities was never documented, but their influence loomed over the case. For the detectives who dared to look too closely, one truth became unavoidable. This was no longer just about a robbery or even a mass killing. It was about secrets the post-war government could not afford to expose. In the end, those leads vanished into locked archives. The official narrative focused solely on Hirasawa, while the darker questions, the ones that traced back to Unit 731 and the shadow of foreign oversight, were buried in silence. Yet silence does not erase evidence. And for those who studied the case in later years, that silence became its own kind of proof. Part 5, the verdict. The trial of Sadamichi Hirasawa opened in Tokyo with overwhelming public attention. Prosecutors framed the case as straightforward. A desperate man drowning in debt, armed with poison and a stolen identity, committing mass murder for financial gain. They leaned heavily on his signed confession, even though he retracted it soon after, citing coercion and confusion. The court admitted the confession as central evidence, reflecting a legal system still rooted in pre-war standards, where the defendant's statement often carried more weight than forensic scrutiny. Hirasawa's defense attempted to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. They highlighted his diagnosis of Korsakoff syndrome, explaining how it impaired memory, disrupted judgment, and made him highly susceptible to suggestion. They argued that his alternating admissions and denials were consistent with this condition. Yet, the court gave little consideration to neurological explanations. Instead, it focused on circumstantial elements: the cyanide discovered in his home, the deputy manager's identification, and the unexplained deposits made under an alias. The verdict was delivered after months of proceedings. Hirasawa was convicted of mass murder and sentenced to death. His lawyers filed repeated appeals, but each was rejected by higher courts. He was transferred to death row, where he would remain for 32 years, an unprecedented length of time for a condemned prisoner. During those decades, his case evolved into a national controversy. Activists, legal scholars, and even former police officers questioned the integrity of the conviction. Some pointed to procedural flaws, others revisited the abandoned military lead. Meanwhile, Hirasawa continued to insist on his innocence. He spent his years in prison painting, his works becoming a silent record of a man trapped between guilt imposed by law and doubt lingering in the public mind. Despite his death sentence, Hirasawa was never executed. His deteriorating health and his advanced age eventually turned his confinement into a de facto life imprisonment. He died in 1987 at the age of 95, still protesting that he had not committed the Teikoku Bank murders. His death closed the legal chapter but not the debate. Supporters petitioned for posthumous retrials, yet all requests were denied. The case was officially settled, but its conclusion left a lasting divide between the letter of the law and the pursuit of truth. Hirasawa's story remains an enduring, cautionary tale of how certainty in court does not always equal certainty. In fact, his conviction stands unaltered, his sentence unfulfilled, and his name permanently tied to a crime that may not have been his. If Hirasawa was not the man who walked into Teikoku Bank that day, persuaded 16 people to drink poison, and vanished into history, then the question is unavoidable. Where is the real killer now?